Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Ken Gelder of the University of Melbourne presents a talk entitled Transnational Draculas.
Are we live?
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our guest, Dr. Ken Gelder. Welcome,
Recording
sir.
in progress.
Ken, can you hear me?
Yes, Matthew. Hello.
Welcome, and I invite you to begin your talk, Transnational Draculas, at your leisure.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for having me along, and hello, everyone. This is a paper called Transnational Draculas. I hope you can all see a PowerPoint there. I hope that's all right. I'm going to begin by just talking about that this novel on the PowerPoint, Elizabeth Kostova's a debut novel, I think her first novel, the best-selling The Historian from 2005. And in that novel, a young woman accompanies her father on a prolonged search for Dracula's tomb, and they travel to Amsterdam, Istanbul, Paris, Athens, Slovenia, actually a range of other European locations. Actually, they go everywhere except, it seems, Transylvania. By the way, do people know the Transylvania Open is on at the moment? It's a new tennis circuit, international tennis circuit event. Very interesting event to have a look at. I was watching it the other day, yesterday. Anyway, okay, they go everywhere except Transylvania in this novel. Each section of this novel is prefaced with a quotation from Stoker's novel, Dracula. Which drives the quest to find out where the vampire is now hiding. The Historian entirely depends on Dracula for its narrative, its themes and atmosphere, demonstrating its sheer familiarity with that novel and its eponymous anti-hero. But it also wants to show that Dracula has somehow exceeded Stoker's novel, outlasting it and outpacing it. Of course, Dracula himself has precisely this ambition in Stoker's novel as he plans his migration from Transylvania to London to become, as he famously tells Jonathan Harker, a stranger in a strange land. Although, of course, he's not the first person to use that particular phrase. In 1908, 10 years after Stoker's novel was published, the sociologist Jörg Simmel published an important essay titled The Stranger. identifying this migrating figure as quintessentially modern. The stranger, as he puts it, is not, quote, the wanderer who comes today and goes tomorrow, but rather the man who comes today and stays tomorrow. This projection into the future of someone who arrives and doesn't leave gives us a good sense of where Dracula is heading after Stoker's novel. So this talk today will, or it might be the evening for you. I'm in Australia, so it is mid-morning. This talk today will track the vampire's arrival in 3 different places: the American South and Japan and Sweden. And wants to suggest as a general observation that the vampire does indeed turn out to be a stranger in a strange land who is nevertheless also already recognizable, even familiar. The vampire, to draw on Jörg Simmel's stranger again, quote, does not belong, even as it makes itself at home. As Simmel writes about the stranger, it indicates that one who is close by is remote, and that one who is remote is near. So let me go to the next PowerPoint if I can do that. There we are. So when did vampires migrate to America? In Stephanie Meyer's popular Twilight novels from 2005 to 2008, vampires are the cold ones, as she puts it, who arrive in the New World early on and soon outnumber the Quileutes, a Native American community from the northwest coast of the United States. Meyer's account of these vampire conquistadors unfolds in Eclipse, her novel Eclipse from 2007, and is presented as if it is an established part of the Quileute legend, with vampires cast as colonial invaders who bring modernity and death to indigenous populations, remaining in perpetual conflict with them right to the present day, since, like all colonials, they never go away. In Seth Grahame-Smith's novel Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter from 2010, vampires migrate to the American South in the late 16th century, that is, well before the time of Dracula, and they go on to become slave traders and plantation owners. Lincoln, in this novel, is horrified by vampires and by slavery. As he gains political influence, he gathers together a sort of crew of light, a phrase used in Stoker's novel, to fight against these vampire slave owners. In New Orleans, he meets the writer Edgar Allan Poe, who's obsessed with vampires. Poe tells Lincoln that vampires persecuted in Europe fled to America to enjoy its freedoms. They loved its lawlessness, he says, its vastness. They loved its remote villages and its ports brimming with the newly arrived. But more than anything, Lincoln, he says, they loved its slaves. In the 2012 film adaptation of Grahame-Smith's novel, directed by Timur Bekmambetov, Lincoln defeats the slave-trading Confederate vampires in the Civil War, personally killing a powerful vampire plantation owner called Adam in a climactic fight on board a train. You can see him there in the poster with the axe in his hand on board the train. In the novel, however, the slave revolts themselves play a much larger role in overcoming the vampires. Lincoln loses some of his family to vampires, but at least the novel concludes, quote, he had driven the worst of them out of America. One particularly troublesome vampire remains, however, John Wilkes Booth. Troublesome for Abraham Lincoln, of course. The Lacanian critic Slavoj Žižek has noted that Bekmambetov's film, and by implication Grahame-Smith's novel, is ridiculous in one sense and revelatory in another, offering a sort of delirious hallucination that literally demonizes the slave trade and Southern secessionism in mid-19th century America. In fact, this particular hallucination has a longer history in vampire fiction, going back at least as far as Anne Rice's vampire Lestat novels. Jason Friedman has talked about Anne Rice's first Lestat novel, Interview with the Vampire, from 1976, as an example of what he calls plantation Gothic. This description certainly applies to the early part of the narrative, where a young man, Louis, recalls his life as a French Catholic slaveholder in 1791, the owner of an indigo plantation in Louisiana called Pointe du Lac, not far from New Orleans. The slavery system was already deeply unstable by this time. In the year Louis begins his story, around 100,000 slaves had risen up against their owners on the French-owned colony of Saint-Domingue, burning down 180 sugar plantations and hundreds of coffee and indigo plantations. The slave revolt in Saint-Domingue aroused, I'm quoting a commentator here, aroused the most intense alarm amongst the possessing classes on both sides of the Atlantic. In Interview with the Vampire, Louis's brother Paul urges his family to leave, to, as he says, to sell all our property in Louisiana, everything we owned, and use the money to do God's work in France. In fact, indigo plantations like Louis were struggling financially by the 1790s. One of the effects of the slave rebellion in sugar-producing Saint-Domingue was a rise in the number of sugar plantations on the mainland. A neighboring French plantation, in Interview with the Vampire, owned by a family called the Freniers, produces sugar. For the vampire Louis, the South is deliriously attracted to this slave-produced substance. He says, I'm quoting him in the novel, he says, "This refined sugar is a poison. It was like the essence of life in New Orleans. So sweet that it can be fatal, so richly enticing that all other values are forgotten." So in this plantation Gothic novel, sugar is a bit like blood, bringing both life and death, and the South is addicted to it. It turns out that the vampire Lestat wanted Pointe du Lac for himself. Like Dracula in Stoker's novel, he aims to acquire property that in this case is tied to the transatlantic slave trade. When he turns Louis into a vampire, Louis realizes that he too is now a kind of slave. That's how vampires increase, he says, through slavery. How else? Later on, Louis leaves New Orleans for Paris rather than Transylvania, returning to Europe to try to discover the origins of vampires, but without success. Barbara Eckstein notes that the links to Paris in Interview with the Vampire are significant. That city, she writes, keeps alive the particular colonial foundations of New Orleans by situating it in the framework of the circum-Atlantic and the Third Coast, that is to say, the Gulf Coast territory of French and Spanish colonialism and the slave trade. New Orleans is cast as a city of new arrivals, what Anne Rice calls migrants of all kinds in the novel, including slaves and slave traders and vampires. There are so many strangers in New Orleans at this time that the vampires themselves go unnoticed. Or rather, like immigrant African slaves in the city, which Anne Rice describes as yet unhomogenized and fantastical, vampires stand out and blend in at the same time. Louis returns to New Orleans at the end of the novel, disillusioned with vampires in Europe, as if New Orleans is now his proper home. "I might never leave New Orleans," he finally tells Lestat, although his future in what is now the post-slavery American South seems almost without purpose. Excuse me. The Mississippi-born novelist Charlaine Harris begins the first of her Sookie Stackhouse novels, Dead Until Dark, in 2001, by both acknowledging and distancing herself from Anne Rice and Rice's influence, really profound influence in the American South in terms of horror fiction. Rice's cosmopolitan New Orleans had mixed together racialized immigrant groups of people from Europe and Africa, including vampires. Some are assimilated and some are not. But in Harris's novels, on the other hand, things are more localized, set in a small provincial town in northern Louisiana called Bonton, not far actually from the town of Shreveport. Bonton makes very little space for racial difference. It's quite different to New Orleans. Speaking about the hotel that she works in, for example, Suki comments, blacks didn't come into Merlot's much. But the question of assimilation, who stands out and who blends in, is now much more significant. When the vampire Bill Compton arrives in town in that novel, some local characters are drawn to him, Suki especially, and some are repelled. Seems that Compton is a kind of contradiction. A vampire stranger and also, it turns out, a local, which means that his arrival is also a return. A Confederate soldier in the Civil War, he had defended Louisiana's right to secede from the Union and remain a slave-owning state. Compton's family is from the Old South, arriving and settling in Louisiana just a few years before the Stackhouses, before Suki Stackhouse's family. He says, my folks were here when Bonton was just a hole in the road at the edge of the frontier. Both the Comptons and the Stackhouses were slave owners. Compton, in fact, returns to Bonton to claim his inheritance, his property. Suki does the same thing after her grandmother is murdered in that first novel. It was my house now, she announces proudly. The house and the 20 acres surrounding it were mine, as were the mineral rights. He was very keen to get the mineral rights on the property as well. No wonder Suki and Bill Compton are drawn to each other. They both take possession of antebellum Southern properties, thus placing themselves at the beginning and the end of white settler domination in the American South. Compton's aspiration to mainstream, as the novel puts it, for assimilation, should be understood in precisely these terms, as a landowner and Confederate in a secessionist Southern state who now wants to be accepted by Americans at large. The emphasis on assimilation, or mainstreaming, as it's called in Harris's Suki Stackhouse novels, links them to what's often called post-racialism. That is, the view that expressions of racial difference are now beside the point, overtaken by a larger national communal imperative, in this case to be American. Although he was the first Black US president, Barack Obama gave significant expression to this post-racial aspiration in his often cited 2004 address to the Democratic National Convention, where he says famously, there's not a Black America and a white America and a Latino and Asian America. There is the United States of America. This speech was given just a few months after Alan Ball's television adaptation of Harris's novels, The True Blood series, began on HBO. In Harris's novels, a minor Black American character called Lafayette is killed early on. But True Blood, the TV adaptation, keeps him alive as a major character who energizes the narrative. Harris's novels had also presented a fun-loving white woman called Tara Thornton, a friend of Suki's who only appears occasionally in those novels. But the True Blood television series turns this figure into one of its key protagonists, a volatile Black, disaffected American. These and other changes to the way racial identities are understood distinguish the True Blood series from Harris's novels and pose a fascinating challenge to those novels' benign post-racial vision. When Tara introduces herself in True Blood in the television series, she notes that she's, quote, named after a plantation. Tara is in fact the name of the antebellum mansion in Margaret Mitchell's epic Civil War novel, Gone with the Wind. Owned and doggedly defended by Mitchell's feisty white Southern heroine, Scarlett O'Hara, the novel says no one was going to take Tara away from her. She would hold Tara if she had to break the back of every person on it. In True Blood, on the other hand, Tara doesn't own any property at all, named after a property, but doesn't own any property, having walked out of her alcoholic mother's makeshift house. Later on, the vampire Franklin kidnaps her, takes her to the secessionist king of Mississippi's antebellum mansion, ties her to the bed, and systematically rapes and abuses her. When she finally escapes, running across the property in her white nightdress, she looks just like a runaway slave. In season 2 of True Blood, Tara meets a troubled Black American man called Benedict and falls in love. But a rich white woman holds them both under her spell, forcing Benedict to commit a number of crimes on her behalf. Finally, released from her cruel influence, Benedict approaches Andy Belfleur, the town's redneck police officer, to confess his crimes. He's clutching a knife, although it seems more like a gesture of disarmament than a threat. But Suki's brother, Jason, who's recently undergone some paramilitary training and wants to become a police deputy, thinks that Benedict is about to attack Andy. So he draws his gun and shoots the Black American man in the back, killing him. Now, this scene is never mentioned in commentaries on True Blood, but it must surely resonate with American audiences who know only too well that fatal shootings of Black American men by white police officers are commonplace, not least in the American South. The 2014 race protests in Ferguson, Missouri, coincided with the last season of True Blood on HBO and followed the fatal shooting by police of a Black American man, Michael Brown. The Hands Up, Don't Shoot slogan became a defining feature of these protests, coming in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign that followed the fatal shooting of George Zimmerman in February 2012 by a white neighborhood watch volunteer in Sanford, Florida. The shooting of Benedict in True Blood addresses the grim fact that white police officers in America shoot and kill a disproportionately high number of Black American men. And the event itself complicates the fantasy framework of white vampires in the American South, seeking either to secede, like the King of Mississippi, or assimilate, like Bill Compton. This is certainly a clear and urgent challenge to the view that the United States is in some kind of post-racial predicament. Trump has since challenged this view in any case. When Tara herself is finally turned into a vampire, she's horrified to realize that she's now the thing she most despises, the very thing that had enslaved her in her previous life. Put to work in Pam's vampire nightclub, she's reprimanded when she tries to assert herself. She tells her employer, "So I'm basically your slave," recognizing that, as she puts it, the more things change, the more they fucking stay the same. Tara's eventually killed at the end of True Blood. The series refuses to assimilate this representative of enslavement, Black American abjection, and racial difference. She's conspicuously absent in the closing scenes of the series, where the remaining cast sit happily around a table in the sunlight, eating and talking peacefully together in a glowing post-racial gesture of community that is strangely haunted, I think anyway, by those characters who are no longer there, like Tara. Excuse me. So for Nina Auerbach, in a book called Our Vampires, Ourselves, from 1995, vampires are defined primarily by their capacity to assimilate, to adapt to their surroundings. They blend into the changing cultures they inhabit, she writes. But they're not indiscriminate in terms of the destinations they choose for themselves. Vampires, she perceptively suggests, go where the power is. For Auerbach, the United States is thus the most appropriate destination for an ambitious modern vampire. But in fact, vampires have migrated to a range of different places around the world, not just the USA. So I want to look briefly, for the moment, at vampires in Japan, turning our attention to two so-called light novels. That's the kind of generic term for them. And they are Hideyuki Kikushi's Vampire Hunter D from 1983. And the well-known anime film director Mamoru Oshii's Blood, the Last Vampire, Night of the Beasts from 2000. Both novels are tied to proliferating series across different media in Japan and the Anglophone world. There are around 30 Vampire Hunter D novels so far, maybe more now, as well as spin-off series and prequels. Really hard to keep track of how many there are. There are also animated films, audio dramas, video games, manga adaptations, and so on. Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust from 2000, which was globally distributed by the Los Angeles-based Urban Vision Entertainment, is also credited as the first Japanese anime film to be originally recorded in English, with a cast of British and American actors providing the voices. These are texts that take the vampire to Japan and then send this figure back out to the Anglophone world, globally. Oshii's novel is transnationally networked in a similar way, a partial adaptation of Hiroyuki Kitakubo's high-quality English language anime film, Blood, the Last Vampire from 2000, which was shown in Canada and Australia sometime before premiering in Japan, and then which was in turn adapted as a Hong Kong, British, French live action film by the French director Chris Nayan in 2009. A long-running spin-off anime television series called Blood Plus, directed by Junichi Fujisaku, premiered in 2005, followed by Blood Sea from 2011 and Blood Sea, The Last Dark from 2012, and there's maybe more since then. Again, these are really hard to keep track of, and I haven't quite kept up. English dubs of these series were distributed in the United States, Australia, and elsewhere, and manga adaptations of these series have also been released in English. So these two vampire novels, these two sort of, points of Japanese origin here, are just a small part of a much larger assemblage of vampire narratives in transnationalized contemporary Japanese media. Kikushi's Vampire Hunter D is a sort of pastiche, a prolonged tribute to the memory of Dracula, distant in terms of place here, but also in terms of time, since the novel is set a long way into the future, 12,090 AD, in fact. It's dedicated to local manga artist Osamu Kishimoto. And also it's dedicated to, quote, the entire cast and crew of Horror of Dracula, a British horror film from 1958, directed by Terence Fisher and starring Christopher Lee as Dracula. Names in Vampire Hunter D are displaced or modified citations. The powerful predatory vampire here is Count Magnus Lee, kind of after Christopher Lee, but modified. And his daughter is Lamia, after Lamia, the mythological woman in John Keats's 1819 vampire poem. Events take place in this novel around a village named Ransilva, not Transylvania, but Ransilva. So you just get this kind of mutation. Somewhere on a remote frontier, the novel says, giving an Eastern calibration to the Western genre, it's a frontier in Japan, and folding the samurai and the cowboy together to produce a local subgenre that Wayne Steen and John Edgar Browning have called Zen Gothic. I quite like that term, Zen Gothic. D himself, the figure D in this novel, is a dhampir. That word, D-H-A-M-P-I-R, is derived from Balkan folklore. The figure is part vampire, part human. D is a solitary, strikingly beautiful man with great fighting skills. Hired by a young woman to protect her family, D finally kills Count Lee by using a trick taught to him, as the novel says, by the sacred ancestor. It's implied that the sacred ancestor is Dracula himself, although the novel can't quite bring itself to speak his name. There's a passage that says, the great vampire, king of kings, and then there's just a hyphen. Dracula functions as a distant point of origin in Vampire Hunter D, but he's also a generative force shown to stimulate and influence events far into the future at the edge of a place that's now barely recognizable, even as Japan. He literally plays out the role of a stranger in the modern and distant future world. Someone who is indeed, to recall Jörg Simmel, both near and remote. In Vampire Hunter D, Dracula somehow arrives in Japan and remains there and orchestrates everything that follows in a series of novels and other media-based narratives that I think so far show no sign of coming to an end. This is why Stoker's novel is understood here as sacred. On the other hand, Vampire Hunter D creates a landscape that is literally marginal to Japan, a distant frontier space that is cast as a kind of mutated, weird anomaly. It's as if Dracula arrives in Japan in order to produce a massive cultural displacement, one that sees the residues of Western vampire narratives like Stoker's Dracula or Terence Fisher's film Horror of Dracula inhabit the very edges of the Far East. Marumo Oshi's novel Blood the Last Vampire is much more directly engaged with contemporary Japan. It opens in Tokyo in 1969, where students are protesting against the Vietnam War. The character called Ray Mirror is involved in the protests, but as he runs from the police, he sees a young girl dressed in a blue school uniform kill a large beast with a Japanese sword. Two men in a dark car arrive and quickly whisk the young girl away. Ray's life at home, this young man, is defined by violence and abuse. When they hear of his involvement in the student riots, his parents forbid him to leave their home. Not long afterwards, a strange man appears in his bedroom. I just knocked and came in, he says. And he introduces himself as a detective called Hijin Gotuda. Students are being killed, he tells Ray, and their bodies are disappearing. Later on, he launches into a long account of the various means of disposing of corpses and of things that come from the grave around the world, he says. It's quite a long speech that he makes in the novel. He says, the Slavs had the vampire, the Russians had the upir, the Greeks had the vrikolakas, and so on and so on. This man, Gotuda, turns out to be an agent from the Vatican of all things, an inquisitor who's tracking vampires as they migrate from country to country. And here he's searching for, in Japan, he's searching for, in particular, for a girl called Saya Otonashi, who is a vampire human hybrid, a bit like Dee in Kikiushi's novel, who Gotuda, this detective, thinks is working for a secret Jewish organization who are also hunting vampires around the world. So it has this kind of complicated non-Japanese connection or genealogy. Now, Saya, this young girl, is enrolled as a transfer student at Ray's school, but she has the reputation at school of being unapproachable. She speaks Japanese, but she's also fluent in English. Ray says at one point, some might think she's a returnee who's been living overseas, someone who's returned. In his commentary on the anime film of Blood the Last Vampire, Neil Baker writes that Saya, this young girl, remains a cipher, I'm quoting him, remains a cipher of indeterminate provenance. Although she speaks in English, she also talks to herself in Japanese and signifies Japanese or Japaneseness through her school uniform and samurai sword. In Kitakubo's film, which is set a couple of years before the novel in late 1966, the high school itself is adjacent to the Yokota US Air Base, an actual air base to the west of Tokyo. And B-52 bombers are flying off to Vietnam. Neil Baker regards the film as a critique, as he puts it, a critique of post-World War II US-Japan security alliances. Although he later thinks the film is ambivalent about this alliance and its various risks and benefits to Japan. Saya's task, the task of this young girl in the film, seems to be to keep the vampires that haunt the US airbase from leaving Japan and causing havoc elsewhere. For example, in Vietnam itself, which was occupied by Japan during World War II. For Christopher Bolton, Saya thus responds, I should say, to, quote, the fear of renewed Japanese intervention abroad. As she pulls a vampire away from one of the departing B-52 bombers, she shuts down, quote, the threat that the monster will escape Japan's shores on America's back, riding on the back of that plane. Although she also ensures the bombers are free to go about their deadly work unhindered. There is certainly an interesting reorientation of Nina Auerbach's notion that vampires, or in this case, part vampires, go where the power is. Saya may be helpful in restraining Japan's imperial ambitions abroad, but both the anime film and the novel raise the question, is she Japanese, or is this essentially an intervention from outside Japan? Baker notes that the film eventually reveals an old photograph of Saya taken from somewhere in Europe and dated 1892. Now, this is just a few years before the publication of Bram Stoker's novel, of course. But as Baker notes, it's also, quote, a period when foreign elements were rapidly introduced into traditional Japanese life. Ray and other students at school think that Saya's connection to a secret global Jewish organization is reflected through her own strange identity or stranger identity. Someone says, for example, she must be a Japanese Jew. Someone else says, do we even know that she's Japanese? She looks foreign. So Saya is indeed an indeterminate figure, simultaneously near and remote. She is a stranger in a strange land. She's familiar in some respects, even traditionally Japanese with her samurai sword, but strikingly different in others, enough to make her stand out as a distinctive figure. The novel ends 30 years into the future, in the late 1990s in this case, with the young man Ray, now much older and married and settled and working, taking on a normalized role in contemporary Japanese society. Saya, on the other hand, remains eternally the age of a teenage schoolgirl, what the novel calls a violently beautiful predatory monster, who may or may not be, it's quite hard to determine this, may or may not be working in Japan's best interests. Okay. So let me just move on now to Sweden. In John Ajvide Lindqvist's novel Let the Right One In from 2004, a vampire child called Eli and her guardian Hakan, who may also be a vampire, arrive in Blackeberg, a suburb in the north, in the outer northwest of Stockholm in Sweden. The year of this novel is 1981, and Blackeberg is a relatively new place, a satellite suburb of Stockholm. Soon, however, it's densely populated, it's full of apartment blocks. The novel says only one thing was missing, a past. Where the 3 storied apartment buildings now stood, the novel says, there had only been forest before. You were beyond the grasp of the mysteries of the place. There wasn't even a church. 9,000 inhabitants and no church. That tells you something of how free they were from the ghosts of history and of terror. So the novel means this quite literally. What troubles this outer suburb is not the ghosts of history at all, but encounters that are specifically to do with Sweden's position in the modern world. Vampires arrive in Blackeberg at the same time, the novel tells us, that, quote, a Soviet submarine runs aground outside of Karlskrona, which is a Swedish naval base. The reference here is to a Soviet whiskey-class submarine, which did indeed surface on the Swedish coast near Karlskrona in October 1981. I mean, this is a novel again that speaks to real historical events. And when it surfaced, it inflamed a local sense of an immediate Soviet threat that led to increased military spending in Sweden and the establishment of tighter controls over its borders. Sweden would become, the novel tells us, a changed nation, a violated nation. That was the word that was continually used, violated. Now, a young vampire, or apparently young vampire, Eli, and her guardian, Hakan, move into an apartment next door to a boy named Oscar Eriksson, who lives with his divorced mother. Oscar is bullied at school and his nose bleeds easily. He's also incontinent. He's an abject figure. He withdraws into a vivid and sometimes murderous fantasy life. When he meets Eli, who seems to be around the same age as him, 12 years old, he begins to take an interest in his new neighbors in this apartment block. His mother complains about their noisy arguments. I just have to say about these new people, she says, what neighbors? Did you hear them? Oscar, however, is more forgiving and more curious, and he listens to the new arrivals through a bedroom wall, an adjoining bedroom wall that is covered with wallpaper, quote, depicting a forest meadow. On the other side, the novel says, on the other side of the forest, there was Eli. Now, this is the closest this Swedish novel gets to Transylvania, of course, which means beyond the forest, Transylvania. Elsewhere, I've written about myself, the figure of the vampire as neighbor, not our vampires ourselves, it's our vampires, our neighbors, in relation to Thomas Alfredson's 2008 film adaptation of Let the Right One In, of this novel, where I drew on Freud's famous rejection of the Christian imperative to love thy neighbor. Freud writes, not merely is this stranger in general unworthy of my love, I must honestly confess that he has more claim to my hostility and my hatred. The Vampire Next Door is the subtitle of an important 1997 essay about modern vampires by Jules Zanger, which had complained that vampires have now lost what he calls their metaphysical and religious features to become, as he puts it, in our concerned awareness for multiculturalism, merely ethnic, like being Sicilian or Jewish. He writes, this new demystified vampire might as well be our next door neighbor, as Dracula, by origin, appearance, cast, and speech, could never pretend to be. But this is quite wrong, I think. Dracula, as we know, when he arrives in London in Stoker's novel, is already the stranger who wants to be neighborly. And that's one reason why he provokes so much hostility amongst Londoners. In any case, the merely ethnic, what Zanger calls the merely ethnic, is a signifier that applies as much to Dracula as it does to Eli in Let the Right One In. And it only adds to the strangeness of the stranger, neighbor, vampire as a migrating figure, welcomed in one way and hated in another. The title of Lindqvist's novel is a command, it's an imperative. That is, one must only let the right one into one's home. You know, like a vampire. Is it a vampire? Is it a Soviet submarine? One must only let the right one in to one's country, one's home, whatever it is. The question of issuing an invitation to a stranger, thus becomes central to the novel. There was this joke going around about the Transylvania Open, the tennis, international tennis circuit event that's on right now, that you had to be invited to enter the tournament. Anyway, I digress. So the question of issuing an invitation to a stranger becomes central to the novel. When Eli appears outside Oscar's bedroom window, a little bit like J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, with whom she has a great deal in common, she tells him, "Say that I can come in." Later on, Oscar is invited to Eli's apartment. "Say that I can come in," he says, repeating her earlier request. "You can come in," she replies. Later on, as Eli grasps the significance of the need to be invited in, he decides to test Eli as she waits outside his door. "Oscar," she says, "you have to invite me in." But he wants to see what happens when he doesn't invite her in. So she steps into his apartment, and in a few moments, blood begins to flow out of her eyes and mouth and her skin. "You can come in, you can," Oscar tells her in a panic. "You're welcome. You are allowed to be here." Earlier in the novel, Eli's guardian, Hakan, ritualistically murders a boy and drains his blood to feed Eli. At the same time, the novel tells us, police arrest 5 Lebanese men in, quote, "the largest drug seizure ever recorded in Sweden." Another reference to an actual event from October 1981. These two events are then tied together in the novel through local gossip and suspicion. And I put the passage on the PowerPoint. There were speculations that the ritual murderer was also a foreigner. It seemed plausible enough. Weren't blood rituals common in those Arab countries? You heard about that. Brutal people. Iran, Iraq, the Lebanese. But Monday, the police released a composite sketch of the suspect, a normal Swede, with a ghost-like appearance of vacant gaze. Everyone was in agreement about that. Yes, this is what a murderer looked like. Every man in the western suburbs who resembled the phantom picture was subjected to long, scrutinizing looks. These men went home and looked at themselves in the mirror and saw no resemblance whatsoever. So this interesting passage, I think, distinguishes locals from foreigners, but then undoes that distinction. The murderer turns out to be a normal Swede, and then distinguishes locals from other locals, right? When you look in the mirror at yourself, there's no resemblance whatsoever. Or rather, it ends by distinguishing locals from vampires, which bring something foreign with them, even when they move in next door. Now, the guardian, Hakan, it's worth noting, is in fact Swedish. He's in the novel, an ex-school teacher from Karlstad. But Eli is more obviously a kind of immigrant, that is not local, or maybe not quite local. Thomas Alfredson has noted that, the director Thomas Alfredson has noted that he cast the actor Lena Leandersson as Eli in the film because she was born in Sweden, but she's also of Iranian descent. And he thought that that would suggest the vampire's foreignness, as he put it. The difference between the foreign and the local are confused here, of course. In Lindqvist's novel, however, Eli's foreignness is differently configured. Oscar recalls a Jewish woman who had visited his school and shown students photographs of concentration camps during the Holocaust. He thinks in the novel, Eli was looking a little bit like people in those pictures. Later on, police hear Hakan calling out Eli's name and recalling Christ's last words on the cross. They wonder if he was calling out to God. The Hebrew connotations of Eli's name give us a contemporary impression of Stoker's representation of Dracula as a fin de siècle, end of the century version of the wandering Jew, and an embodiment of anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Eastern European Jew as a threat to national economies in the West. Olga Litvak captures this sense that this figure seemed, from a Western perspective in particular, both near and remote, a version of Jörg Simmel's Stranger, when she writes, quote, "For the emancipated Jewries of Western Europe, the invasion of Jewish Eastern Europe was uncanny, not because the Eastern Europe Jew was entirely alien, but because he was a shade too familiar." But in Let the Right One In, Eli's Jewish connotations are downplayed. She is, we could say, both a shade too familiar and just a shade too foreign or alien. In any case, she poses no threat to the national economy of Sweden, at least not in the novel or the film. Unlike Dracula, who buys property in London and accumulates wealth from across Europe, Eli and her guardian Hakan are itinerant renters, and they seem impoverished. On the other hand, they kill and feed on a number of locals, including a young boy, a helpful man who thinks that Eli is malnourished, and a woman, Virginia, who has trouble committing to long-term relationships. This woman, Virginia, thinks at one point, let a person in and he hurts you. Eli in Let the Right One In is a little bit like Saya in Blood the Last Vampire. That is an indeterminate figure, someone who, just like the stranger, makes herself at home, but does not belong. She's also sexually indeterminate, although she dresses as a girl. Oscar thinks she is a girl early on, but she tells him, I'm nothing, not a child, not old, not a boy, not a girl, nothing. The first half of the novel uses the pronoun she to describe her. And then in the second half, it switches to the male pronoun he. Her guardian, Hakan, is in love with Eli and is presented in the novel as a homosexual paedophile on the run from police after locals burned down his house in Karlstad. He disfigures himself with acid. He disfigures his face with acid when he's about to be discovered after trying to drain someone's blood. Later, Eli kills and feeds on him in the novel, but he rises from the dead and seeks Eli out, tying the young vampire down. This is only in the novel, not in the film adaptations. Tying the young vampire down in an attempt to sodomize him, which is the male pronoun used in the second half of the novel. In her book on the film adaptation, Anne Bilson has suggested that, quote, sexuality is conspicuous by its absence in Let the Right One In. But this is certainly not true of the novel, where Eli's growing intimacy with Oscar means that Oscar will eventually take Hakan's place as her guardian. Hakan was Eli's guardian and lover, but he'd also, quote, entered into Eli's service, a bit like Tara in True Blood with Pam, or Louis with Lestat in Interview with the Vampire. When they travel together, they travel together, completely inseparable. Vampire narratives since Dracula have invariably cast the arrival of the stranger vampire as a viral threat to a nation's sense of well-being. As Let the Right One knows very well, vampire narratives can therefore directly address a nation's anxieties about the arrival of foreigners, immigrants, asylum seekers, and so on. It tells us, the novel tells us, that Sweden feels violated when its borders are breached, as if something violently sexual has happened. Oscar feels infected when Eli kisses him and recognizes to his horror that, quote, I'm going to become a vampire. A transformation we don't see, incidentally, in the film adaptations. Later on, before he kisses him again, Eli says to Oscar, would you want to become like me. So the novel turns locals into stranger vampires, even as it confuses the differences between them. It presents the vampire's kiss as a violation, but it's also massively liberating and invigorating. I'm just quoting from the novel. For a few seconds, Oscar saw through Eli's eyes, and what he saw was himself, only much better, more handsome, stronger than what he thought of himself, seen with love. So this is the dual effect of the arrival of the immigrant, who's both welcome, that is, invited in, and vilified and hated, regarded as an assault on or a violation of local and national identities. The immigrant opens borders and secures them at the same time. In June 2016, Sweden limited the possibility of asylum seekers from the Middle East especially gaining residency permits. As the New York Times commented, quote, "One of the most welcoming countries for refugees has now introduced tough new restrictions on asylum seekers, including rules that would limit the number of people granted permanent residency, and made it more difficult for parents to reunite with their children." It's a very topical issue still, of course. At the end of Let the Right One In, Eli has rescued Oscar and they've bonded, with Oscar, just like Hakan before him, infected by this strange vampire figure. He leaves his home, his mother, and Blackberg, and gets on board a train on the Stockholm-Karlstad line with an old-fashioned trunk beside him, excuse me, with Eli hiding inside the trunk. So this is, in one sense, an act of people smuggling. Karlstad is where Hakan came from. It's west of Stockholm on the way to the North Sea. We remember that Dracula travels west in Stoker's novel as he makes his way to London to become a stranger in a strange land. The train conductor asks Oscar, "Is someone meeting you at the other end?" But no one will meet them, and it'll be evening when the train arrives at its destination. Let the Right One In, the novel, takes permanent residency apart, investing instead in migration in the hope that one might be welcomed when one arrives and invited in, the hope that one might be the right one. There is, of course, no suggestion that Oscar and Eli are actually going to leave Sweden, even as they travel west. But this is consistent with the predicament of the stranger in the modern world, as the man who comes today and stays tomorrow. Thank you. That's the end of my talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I know you're very short on time at this point, so I'm just going to leave you with two quotes here from Dracula that I think are rather apt. Dracula says, "The glories of the great races are a tale that is told." That comes to mind. And he also says, "Welcome the coming and speed the parting guest."
Yes. I always remember Gary Oldman's line in the wonderful Francis Ford Coppola adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, that line where Jonathan Harker knocks on the door, and Dracula is quite well. Actually, the question of whether he's a good host or not a good host is that's a good question to ask. But he does say, "Welcome, enter freely of your own will." Right, so it kind of puts a responsibility on the person who is entering.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and leave some of the happiness you bring.
The whole house sort of shakes at that moment as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's always true in vampire narratives. That point of entry where you step over the threshold is a really important. It becomes a very important thing in vampire stories.
Fascinating. So I know you have to dash, so I don't want to keep you from your appointment, but I want to thank you very much for coming on and giving us this talk. I'm always delighted when somebody's talking about Let the Right One In, because so few people do. I want to invite everybody to tune in tomorrow night for Dr. L. Andrew Cooper's talk on Dario Argento. Invite you to take the survey that Juan is placing in the various chats, and remind you to always stay spooky.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.